is Still Journeying. I'm Steven. This show was born out of a desire to gather some of my closest co-laborers in the faith, to talk, reflect, and share stories from our journeys into and out of different church contexts. The name Still Journeying is a play on the biblical idea of sojourning, being people in motion, not yet home, but faithfully walking with God through the tension. That's something many of us in the Asian American Christian community know intimately, navigating inherited traditions, modern faith, and generational change. These first 3 episodes are a pilot. Depending on how it resonates, I may continue with more. For now, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to our second episode. For this episode, I'm going to be doing a half interview, half discussion with the folks here, and I wanted to talk to my professor here, Daniel K. Ng, who is now recently now an associate professor of New Testament studies at Western. Everyone's giving the little promotion and applause, but we have been in 2 classes together, the New Testament survey class, I forget the actual name, Interpreting Acts to Revelations, I think. And then the second class is Asian American Ministry Formation. So thank you for traveling here from Portland. Just wanted to kind of launch right into it and kind of ask first, what was sort of your motivation in teaching an Asian American Ministry Formation class?
My motivation for teaching this class, one of the things that I experienced in seminary was that a lot of the ministry classes that we were taking really was serving the majority culture well. And there are a lot of things I could pick up from that. But there were times when I was sitting in class and I was like, I don't know if that would work at my church. I don't know if that would work at my immigrant church. I don't even know if it would work at my Asian American church. Things like, I remember there was one time where it was a pastoral leadership class, and one person said, "Okay, how do I get my church to do this?" And he's like, "Oh, just go to the deacon meeting and just say, hey, this is what we'd like to do." I'm like, I can't do that. Like, the deacons are like Uncle so and so. He started the church. I can't just walk in and say what I want. And then and I'm thinking to myself, and I was actually talking after class to a Korean American classmate, and he's like, I can't do that either. Like, no, that's like a no, right? And so I realized that some of the things that we were encountering were things that really weren't translatable. And I use that word purposefully. Like, they really didn't translate to my experiences and my context. And so as I was in pastoral ministry, one of my mentors at Talbot called me up and said, hey, I'm starting this new Doctor of Ministry program at Talbot. It's in Asian American ministry. I'd like you to be part of it. So after thinking through and praying through that decision, I started doing that. And that was really formative for me, being part of a seminary program where I had classmates who were in similar ministry contexts as me, where it was actually the topic of discussion instead of we were kind of on the margins of it. And so encountering things like, hey, how are our churches unique, or how are our churches distinct? How put it that way, was helpful for me, but also thinking through like how I'm formed as a leader, and so on. And so now on this side of PhD, realizing that I have an opportunity to provide that and say, hey, I want to have a time and space where we can talk about both ministry and how leadership is formed. So I called it Asian American Ministry Formation because it's also about forming the leader.
For those who are primarily almost in the Asian American church their whole lives, or those who have never been in it, what would you say are some of the unique distinctives? And I'll open that question afterwards to anyone who wants to add their own thoughts as well.
So a lot of the churches that we're part of and was kind of the centering part of our discussions would be what many people consider like an immigrant church, where it starts with people who have migrated to the U.S., whether it's as an immigrant or as a student or even as refugees, where they come, and there's different distinctive things that actually make them kind of non-centered in American society, whether it's language and culture and things like that. And it might start as a Bible study, or it might start as a fellowship, and then becomes a church. Uh, and then kind of with the typical life cycle, we start adding like a children's ministry that's in English, youth ministry, and so on. And a lot of times that becomes another worship service. So sometimes you end up with, a lot of times you end up with both a mother tongue congregation and an English speaking ministry as well. And there's dynamics involved in that. We're going to be talking about that as well. And so that is kind of the typical uh, experience for many of us. And so that was actually a big part of that discussion. But we started talking about, hey, how does it continue to grow? And there's different ways that it continues to grow in different and mature in different places and contexts.
Can you explain like the curriculum of your course? Like what are like the things that you go over, I guess, like throughout the weeks?
Sure. Yeah. I made it into 3/3. The first third is about Asian American history and how has our experience been unique as Americans with Asian roots. And I realized we can't really talk about what we're doing and where we go without knowing where we've been. And so part of it is a lot of us have never really learned about Asian American history.
Mm.
Like that's not something many of us learn in school, especially if we're in regions where we're that much of a minority. So part of it is just reading. We read through a short book on Asian American history and just let's talk about reflecting on that and talking about, hey, how do you think this impacted ministry? Like when there were Chinese railroad workers or after the Korean War, and you're seeing people come, what kind of needs were there for these immigrants, and how do you think that people minister to them? I'm actually kind of waiting for kind of a history of the Asian American church or history of Asian American evangelicalism. And I'm hearing more and more about how scholars are kind of putting that together, and I'm really excited to be able to kind of put those things together. So, how does that impact you? How does that impact ministry, and so on? Another third is your own formation as a leader. And so, tell me about talk about your own migration experience, your family's migration experience. How do you think that impacted you? Uh, and so, actually, that's still part of the first third. The second third would be more about like what's going on with the Asian American church. We talk about different church models and what kind of different dynamics involved in that. So a lot of the dynamics have to do with how the mother tongue ministry interacts with the English ministry. That's a big part of that discussion, right?
No
So
interaction.
that could be so those are like KMEM, or those are English congregation, Chinese congregation, kind of stuff like that. So like how does that interact? Like what are the different leadership models, things like that. And then the third is contextualization. And we'll talk about this more as well, is like how do I minister in this context where it might be distinct, I'll put it that way, distinct from what we might do with the majority culture. Like how do I minister, and how do I have messages that would fit my demographic? And every good minister missionary does that.
I think one of the most beneficial things for that class for me was just personally being able to name a bunch of things that I had seen. I grew up in a Chinese American church background, but because my parents weren't there, I always felt like, oh, like when I'm there on Mother's Day service and it's an all congregation thing, all my friends are sitting with their families and I'm kind of by myself, and like remembering feeling left out there. And then I went to a Korean church for college, and I didn't know all the K dramas. I didn't watch Crash Landing on You. Like, I didn't know that you're supposed to order jjajangmyeon and jampong and mix them together. Like that thought had never occurred to me until I went there, and I also felt a little bit excluded there. And now I'm at a Japanese American church, which obviously like there's not as many Japanese immigrants in the first place, and on top of that, like it's a very different culture as well. But I think what was so helpful about your class was just the ability to name the different cultures, to name the different models, to name the reasoning behind all the different models. And it really helped me just start to identify a lot of the ways that my own upbringing / my own identity ethnically and experientially just rubbed against those rough edges of those churches, or also was encouraged and blessed by those churches. And I think that was a really eye-opening part of the class, that contextualization. One thing that you talked about in your class was the 3D gospel, and that is something that we have one person here who's a navigator staff and another one who's looking to go on missions with pioneers. It's typically a missiology related study. It's targeted towards missionaries who are going to other countries. First, I guess, in a few words, what is the 3D gospel, if you don't mind explaining? And then second, why did you choose to go over that during your time in the class and devote time to it?
Yeah, the 3D Gospel is a book that is written by a missiologist named Jason Georges. And he has experienced different kinds of cultures. And one of the things that he noticed was that the gospel hits different people groups in different ways. And he's saying, no, it's all the gospel. And I think that one of the things that was eye-opening for me reading through it was seeing how the gospel, as the New Testament presents it, has different facets, kind of like a diamond. So he says, for many of his readers, we might be coming from what he calls a guilt innocence culture, where when you talk about sin, for example, it's you've broken a rule, right? You've done something that is that violates some standard, and so the solution would be something like a courtroom, where hey, you're not guilty, okay? But then he says there's other cultures where a different part of the gospel ministers to them in different ways. So he talks about an honor shame culture, and an honor shame culture is more collectivistic instead of individualistic. So honor shame would be characterized by how you fit with the group, and that group could be the family, could be the clan, it could be the nation, and things like that. And so we use terms like esteem or reputation or face. And so with something like sin, for example, then it's like, okay, you've been disloyal to God, instead of saying you've broken a rule. And so the solution to that would be a restoration to relationship. You see where we're going with this? And then he also talks about fear power cultures, how in many of them there's a big emphasis on the unseen world, where in these cultures, especially in many tribal societies, there's forces that are at play that we don't see. And so when we think about things like superstitions or things like magic and power, then we're thinking about, okay, what are we seeing? What are we doing that is appeasing these unseen forces? And so when we think about sin, then we're saying, or when we're thinking about brokenness, or we're thinking about things that are not right, we're thinking, okay, there's this cosmic battle that's going on between good and evil, so how do these unseen forces affect us? And he says, if you notice, the gospel talks about each of these things, and he has this really good exposition of Ephesians, where he talks about how the gospel impacts these things. So he talks about, hey, some of us are very familiar with the guilt innocence part, like, hey, it's by grace you've been saved, it is a gift of God, things like that. But then he says, look at the collectivistic, the honor shame part. Hey, you were once far, now you've been brought near. You were once excluded from citizenship, now you're actually part of the group, right? And so that is all about collectivism. That's all about being part of this group. And then he says, look at the armor of God. That is fear power, talking about the unseen forces of the evil one. Right? So this is what he's saying, is that like when you go and minister to different cultures, there might be a different way of seeing the world that you need to be aware of. Now, any systems where we make things very very simple is always overgeneralizing.
Yeah.
But in general, we actually see that societies fall into these categories. And so my point of bringing up the reason why I brought this up in an Asian American ministry course is saying, hey, Asian culture is generally honor shame based. And so you start to look at how things like things in the Bible where it ministers to that honor shame society, that helps you to kind of see what might stand out to somebody and how to minister to them in that way. So, for example, like I grew up I grew up with an idea that Romans was about the Romans road. I sinned, Jesus died on the cross, you believed, and so on, right? And so you can I've memorized Romans 3:20, Romans 3:23, Romans 6:23, like all this way, and that's the way of the gospel. But Paul starts off. He says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel," and he mentions people groups. First for the Jew, then for the Greek. What's going on with that? That is honor shame. And so when we need to start thinking about, okay, well, there's much more to Romans than just kind of these truths that we pick out. It's there, but there's other things. And so, like I said, the gospel is like a diamond where there's different facets to it. A lot of times we emphasize one over the others, and that's okay. But somebody else might see things differently because that ministers to them in a different way.
Mm.
Then you think that for people who are in Asian American ministry context, like to be quote unquote effective, like we have to bring in the blend of Western civilization thought and the Eastern Asian civilization thought too. So I'm thinking, how can we blend this idea of individual guilt versus the collective honor? And how do you kind of see that happening, or how can we like use that knowledge to minister to the Asian Americans?
I think the approach would be much like Paul in Ephesians, where we say, "Hey, this is true, but this is also true about the gospel," and to say, "Hey, some of you might relate to this part, but there's also this other part where you are you can see things in a different way." So it's not just that you yourself are right with God, but you are right with the community. And so I think being able to say, hey, there's different facets of this is important. So for our understanding that even within the people we're ministering to, someone might relate to one part more than the other is more than half the battle.
So then how would you articulate the gospel? Because I think growing up, like the very simple, like very individual, like gospel formula was taught in terms of, yeah, this is how you evangelize the people. Um, like the idea of you and God was supposed to have this beautiful relationship, but because of sin, the relationship was broken. But because God loved you, he sent you his son, Jesus Christ, who will restore the relationship with you. So now you have that restored, beautiful relationship with God. It's completely individual. It's all about my relationship with God that was severed by sin, but now is intact. But if you want to bring in that collective mindset of honor versus shame, how would you articulate a fuller picture of the gospel?
How would I articulate?
Sorry, what was that?
All of what you said is true. We got to affirm that that's something we need to uphold all the time. I think we also want to include things that would make us think about being part of a whole, being part of a group. And so if we're saying, okay, there was supposed to be a relationship that we let down God, or we were disloyal to God, instead of saying, okay, we violated a standard. So there's a relationship there. But then also, when you start following Jesus, you're part of a community. You're part of the church. And so what does it mean to be a citizen of the kingdom? What does it mean to be ambassadors for Christ? And so when we look at the Gospels and we say, oh, the gospel of Jesus Christ, we're seeing, oh, Jesus is talking about the kingdom, and it's not just about this vertical relationship. And when he talked about the greatest commandment, he said, hey, love God, but then also love others. And so that is all big part of the gospel, where you're saying, hey, when you start following Jesus, you're part of a community, but you're also representing the kingdom as well.
I think it's interesting because I feel like that really emphasizes salvation. But what I'm realizing in my life, like most of my life is going to be sanctification. And I feel like that is like part of the gospel where I didn't really study up on. I didn't really understand. It really was the just like that gospel, statement and that understanding, and even evangelizing. It's like evangelizing that versus like this life that we live that is really a lot of it is sanctification, right? Hopefully, yes, salvation happens, but yeah, I think that's a really great point that you brought up.
Yeah, no, Daniel, I love what you just shared because you know that Tim Keller quote where he said a lot of people think the gospel is A through C of a Christian life, as in you only apply the gospel to the justification and it's all about salvation. But he says the gospel is A through Z, the entirety of Christian life, where even your sanctification is rooted in the gospel. And yeah, just the story of the gospel, how we sometimes share is so like limited. And it's as if the gospel story is just about how we can get a ticket to heaven, right? It's just like, oh, like I'm saved, thank God. But it really is a story of how God restored not just our individual relationship, but as a collective, as a humanity, as a family, that God saved us and he set apart and he secured a group of people, like his people, who can come together for his glory. So I think just the understanding of the fuller picture of what gospel really is does actually bring this whole like the 3D gospel that you talked about. Like it doesn't only talk about the right and the wrong, but it does also talk about like honor and shame. It does talk about power and fear. Like it is all there. But I do think within like a specific culture, we tend to focus on only like one part of that. Yeah.
Yeah, Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And I think we understand the truth and the life. But I've been going through a book with a brother called Practicing the Way by John Mark. Yeah. And we're like, what about the way? What about this life? I mean, in a previous, time that we were sharing, she was like, am I here just to suffer? Like, no, like the full picture is like we get to live, like you said, a beautiful life with Christ, right? And that is part of the gospel too. Yeah.
One of the things that stood out the most, probably the most insightful line from that entire book, the 3D Gospel book, was where they said that all of us are essentially a mix of those three emphases in terms of the fear, the shame, and the guilt driven frameworks. But all of us need to experience the gospel in each of those aspects individually. And that was actually really, really true for me in my battle with pornography. For like 15 years of my life, I had no victory over that because no one taught me the gospel of power over fear. Like in my churches that I grew up in, no one really said, you have the ability to stand up to this, not because you yourself are capable, but because God has given you this spirit of power that needs not fear the lies the devil is feeding you that keep making you turn back like a dog to his own vomit. And that framework was actually not clear to me until I started grasping at the 3D gospel, until I started wrestling with this idea of God's work being on all these aspects. And I would say the same thing for shame, right? I obviously, like many of us here, I'm assuming I've grown up in that guilt-based framework, but the fact that God shows favor and honor to me as an individual, and to sort of just bring me in and desire to place me at that seat, right? When we read passages like Psalm 23, where it says like, my cup overflows, that's the double portion idea, right? Where God is showing favor to me as a guest. God is interested in showing the people around this analogous audience that I'm interested in this person. I like this person. I want to show to the people that this is one of my favored. And that idea, in all of my dirtiness and all of my brokenness, in the guilt driven framework that I was living with, it just was very strange to see that I was honorable, even amidst all of the ways that I felt like I was still quote unquote guilty, right? And I think all these things intertwined within me and continue to intertwine within me. So a huge portion of this is sort of, to your point, like how do we articulate that while blending all the different aspects? I think it kind of starts with seeing to me at least, the effect that it's had on my own life, and being able to at least say, here's what it did for me in this aspect, and here's what it did for that aspect. But it's an incredibly difficult thing to go through, because you're almost relearning the fundamentals. It kind of feels like you're not forsaking the faith by any stretch, but you're learning these dimensions that have never been there before.
Yeah, I'm just gonna build off of that. When I read a different book when I was in college called The Gospel for Real Life by Jerry Bridges. Very good book. And it just went super in depth into the gospel and how it applies to everyday life. And I really enjoyed it. But then when I read this 3D gospel book, I felt like everything I had learned from that other book was true and good, but it felt like I had gone really deep into a pond. And now all of a sudden there was an ocean for me to explore. I was like, well, there's all these different other dimensions now. I can go super deep into something that feels like unknowable, like ultimately. And so I guess it was really eye-opening. It was really beautiful. And I love that. And then kind of wrapping back around to the question of like, how do you articulate it? For me, what's been most helpful isn't to necessarily think about those three big pictures, but to think of the gospel in terms of themes. Especially when you're talking to someone, you're listening to their story, trying to find themes of what they're experiencing in their own life, And so it'll conjure a different image, right? So like if you want to be pardoned, right? Like we could fit that into the guilt innocence thing. You're talking about someone who's holding on to something, right? And they need to be released from it, right? Or it's like, I need to be rescued, right? That's going more towards the fear power. And so like, it doesn't necessarily matter which ones you categorize it specifically, unless you think that thing is fun. It's like, oh, does this person need to be pardoned? Does this person need to be rescued? Does this person need to be invited? Like, so like what theme, what kind of action is Jesus going to input into their life that they're looking for? That's kind of how I think more about articulating the gospel to people. But it started with 3D gospel.
Yeah, I think all this, these conversations about how we minister to people who are a blend of these different cultures is really important and really helpful. But I think before we kind of like really dive into that, I want to ask the question like, what do you think the relationship between Asian Americans and these two cultures really stands? What I mean by that is like, I think probably, okay, I'm gonna make a ton of generalizations right about now, but I'm sure all of your parents really buy into this whole honor shame thing, really are like all about like don't lose face, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you ask the average Asian American what their perspective on Asian shame culture is, they probably have an extremely toxic relationship with it. They probably hate it. A lot of Asian Americans, they're very proud of their Asian Americanness, but that it only scratches the surface of like, I like boba and I like whatever, I like watching anime, and like, but like when we talk about the real like depths of culture, when we start talking about shame and family and these things that are deeper and are where the roots of culture actually come from, most Asian Americans don't actually like what they grew up with, because maybe they grew up in America and they experienced what something else could be. They dream of that, American sitcom family, and they never got that, And so I guess for you guys, what is kind of your experience with What's your relationship like with honor shame culture, and like, do you feel like you buy in?
I mean, that's a actually really good question. I think just the way Austin said that too, the idea of a lot of Asian Americans I know are proud of their culture, but at the same time, when we think about our honor versus shame culture, we think that's just toxic. I think we've seen so many negative sides of it, and we really just try to almost escape it or just press it underneath. I mean, for myself, do I really think of the gospel in honor and in shame? I mean, honestly, that's the thing. Like, I think all of us actually know what shame is like. That's a thing. But we don't know the beauty of honor. I think that's where the discrepancies really at, where we experience a negative of a culture, but we haven't really fully experienced the beauty or the strength of a culture. And the idea of God really brought honor into my life. I mean, that's a hard concept for me to internalize, to be honest. Even just saying that statement felt little weird, like little new to me. Um, yeah, and I think so too. When I look at my just people in the church, these like young adult Asian Americans, I really don't know if again like they know what shame is and they know shame is bad, right? Like they hate. I mean they hate shame so much. Even the idea of healthy guilt carries negative connotation. It's even hard to talk about righteous guilt in church sometimes because they easily relate that with shame. But the idea of how does then God bring honor into your life? That's yeah, I don't know. Does anyone else really like talk about that in the church?
I really like the idea of like Asian Americans haven't experienced honor. And I think that's because Asian Americans are a young cohort, and the way you earn honor is you age, you know? And so we haven't had time to accrue our honor, you know? And so I think we've only really experienced a lot of the negative aspects of being shamed, being told that what we're doing is shameful. We're bringing shame upon our family and our name. Um, yeah. Any other thoughts?
Sorry, my thought to that actually, and I'll kind of float it and we can come back to it too, is just like I actually think God honors all of us as followers. We just have trouble naming it because of, to your point, that like sort of experience. And as a result, it makes us not even be able to recognize when we're actually receiving love in the form of honor, if that makes any sense. Like, because we're almost like infantile in our understanding of it. When like I grew up around my family, whenever they talked about like looking this way or like dressing up that way and having that sort of love conveyed through that framework, I think I didn't understand it because it didn't seem like something that my head could articulate or my head understood in terms of how I was being honored by my parents. Like I wasn't able to name it because I didn't even have the words for that. I grew up in a Western system which articulated when you were being praised for doing good and when you were being berated for doing bad. But that is not necessarily, I think, how my parents thought of it. This was one of the most important moments I had with my dynamics with my parents, just realizing that I had interpreted so many things that they said from a guilt standpoint. You're guilty of not being good enough. You're guilty of not having hit the competency levels. But what they were really trying to articulate is, hey, son, we would be proud of you regardless, but we also want to motivate you to pursue these things, to bring honor for the whole household, for the whole family name. And I didn't understand that as a form of love because my guilt framework articulated it as, why aren't you going to attain all these things? Why are you guilty of falling short of all these claims? And that, sorry, it's a little long-winded. It's just this weird mistranslation, right, of the cultures that creates a difficult relationship, even from my parents who aren't believers. And this actually was far more interesting for me when Sonia and I started being together, because I had to learn that her parents were Christians, but still had an honor shame framework. And they were articulating things in that way as well. So just a few thoughts in relation to that.
I think my brain is still like not functioning with your question. Like I really, am struggling to find an example of like what honor like looks like. Does it like mean like duty? Like I don't know. Like is it like this badge that we're supposed to be proud about like as a Christian? Like anybody have like examples? Like what is this?
So when I think about bringing honor, I the first thing that comes to my mind is Mulan. You're bringing honor to your family, you know. But when I think about honor, it's like the value and the dignity of a person in the collective scene, as in, like, even in Asian American culture, what's that saying? Like, the nail that sticks out gets hammered, and you try not to stick out. Right? You try to be part of the collective. You try to be part of the whole, and not to make yourself stand out too much. Like in the same sense too, like you don't want to bring shame upon the collective you belong to. Like if you're part of a community, like shame isn't actually individual. It's that within the community you bring like dishonor, shame upon the collective. So to bring honor is to bring like value and dignity, not just to yourself, but to the group that you belong to. So when I think about how does God restore my honor, it's within the community that you're part of. First, God brings you into the part of God's family, that's the congregation you're part of. And then within that group, within that collective, that you bring dignity and you bring value to the community you're part of. And that's not by works, that's not by how you perform, but it is simply by being a child of God. And how, as all of us are child of God, we all bring these value and dignity into the family of God. And that's how, as a collective, we have, again, value and worth. And I think that's kind of like where my mind was at when I think about how does God bring honor. Like in a secular world, I would say, again, like what you can offer to the collective, right? What you can bring to the community is how you bring honor to the community. But in the gospel-centered message, I would say it's, as a Christian, like because you're valued by God and you're valuable to God, like you bring value to the community you're part of. I don't know. I hope I'm making sense. That's just like my initial raw thoughts.
Yeah. So for any of the audience who maybe are just listening and not looking, I am not Asian American. My family's Hispanic, Dominican specifically. But I do a lot of work with Asians because of my ministry. Maybe I'll tell that story at another time. But so you can take what I say with a grain of salt. But I would say my perception of honor is about name. What do people think of when they hear your name? And this idea of like guilt comes from what you think about yourself, but the shame comes from what other people think about you. And so then kind of works in reverse, right? Like the justification is like what you think about yourself, like, oh, I'm good. The honor comes from, oh, what do other people say about me? Kind of relating to your community idea. It is what does my name reflect on the community, and what do people see me? What does my name mean to them? That's kind of my perception of how the honor works. And so I think the way that it plays out the most is in like wealth and prestige, right? Like if you have a lot of money and you have a lot of status, people are always going to say good things about your name. Mm-hmm. And so that's what a lot of people, what I observe, a lot of Asian American families are like striving towards, for that wealth, the financial security, and for the prestige, usually through work. That'll come along with that. Yeah.
Wait, sorry, I just have one more thought in terms of just honor. And it just clicked to me, right? Like the idea of honor versus shame. I mean, yeah, Tony, as you're talking, it kind of clicked with me. Yeah, I sometimes, not sometimes, I thought about, this is how I think too. Like, do I make my church look better, or do I make my church look worse? And that's how I value myself in the church community. And I definitely thought about that in my previous church back in Champaign, about, are my actions making my church look more favorable, or am I making my church look worse? And that's how I, again, attribute value to myself. Like, what do I bring to the community? And yeah, like when I think about how does God bring honor into my life, like again, it's not what I do for the church that brings me value to who I am within the church, but it's just who I am in Christ that adds value to the church, I guess, as a whole.
Austin, your question was like the relationship between Asian Americans and this whole honor shame kind of worldview.
Yeah.
I think one thing that affects us is one thing that affects us in that department is our relationship with just being Asian in the first place. And I think it depends on where we grew up, the voices that we had around them, and so on. And so there's parts of us that are proud of being Asian, and there's parts of us that are ashamed of being Asian. And so it has to do with your environments. How much of a minority were you? So, like, moving out to California, for example, where people grew up around a lot of Asian Americans, I'm making some observations where people have less of that. I call it self-hatred, being in the margins because they're less of a minority. But even things like the public perception of our people group can impact that. So, for example, like growing up, I noticed that Korean Americans were much, much more likely to cheer for South Korea at the Olympics than were Chinese Americans to cheer for the People's Republic of China.
We're the bad guys. It's tough,
yeah,
man.
exactly. Yeah. So we could talk about why, but there's a distinct experience being Chinese American, Korean American in American society that would cause that to happen. Right?
Absolutely.
And so along with that is that when we see something that's more distinctly Asian, how do we feel about it? Do we feel like, oh, I should embrace that, or do I feel like, hey, let me push that to the side?
Yeah, and I think a lot of Asian Americans view church as something very distinctly Asian.
Yes.
They don't view it as independent from culture, And so a lot of people's relationship with their Asianness dictates their relationship with God in a lot of ways. And I noticed that a lot growing up as well. And so like myself, my relationship with my father was very stereotypically Asian. Like, he never said I love you. The first hug that I remember giving him since I was a small child was at my wedding, and it was like the awkwardest hug of all time. I didn't want to hug him. But my dad embodied like the best parts of honor shame to me. I knew that he was so proud of me, even though he would never say it. And he has never said it to me. But like, why would he need to say it, But a lot of other people, their relationship with their father is not like that at all. And oftentimes I saw a lot of correlation of like them translating that as like their perception of God and their perception of church as well, as being like, God is a God who shames me constantly, who has unrealistically high expectations for me. And when I fall and fail, he just tells me that I'm worthless. And that is how God sees me too. And so, I really hope that I can learn how to, give a gospel presentation that speaks to a lot of that hurt and brokenness that I think is very unique to the Asian American experience.
One of the things that you talked about during our lecture for the class, I wasn't there, but it was in San Jose, was sort of this exercise of, is this Confucian? Is this American? Is this Christian? It could be one, two, or even three of those things. And that was a very fascinating exercise for me to continue to do. And I think it actually goes back to your question of, do you buy into honor shame? I think when people think of authority nowadays, for example, there's a dirtiness to authority. There's like this cultural hurt that has occurred around that term that makes it hard for people to see it. But we know that if you dig into the gospel and the authority of God and the authority of Christ, we see all of those as good, because we've kind of relatively well understood that. I think the same practice just has yet to be thoroughly exercised, perhaps, with regards to honor. Submission is another dirty word that has not been redeemed slash returned to the gospel definition. And these are the sorts of phrases that when you say them, people hear it and they associate it with the broken, earthly, fleshly, sinful variation that caused a lot of traumatic and difficult experiences for people that might not necessarily be indicative of God's design, or maybe even perhaps be the exact opposite of how God interpreted or designed it to be. So I think for me, one of those things that I've been learning is trying to take these things and really fish for what that looked like, even to perhaps the original audience, right? And this is where like seminary is great and bad at the same time, because I'm like learning about these people from 2000 years ago who were dealing with a very different culture and yet eerily similar despite the 2 millennium that separate us, and contextualizing around who they were and their people and what it meant to them when you brought up the idea of honor, what it meant to them when you brought up the idea of fear, these words and these definitions, and how we read our own culture into it. That whole process, I think I'm really been learning through. Honestly, that class probably was a launching pad for trying to really get all of the fluff from all of these different cultural audiences not thrown out, because they're still good and there's still parts of God that are represented by each of those cultures, but to figure out where is this part of God's design of us in his own image and where is it becoming this like brokenness that sin has taken and then twisted this thing into something worse. So
I'm trying to formulate my question here, but I feel like it's really interesting, like hearing about the 3D gospel, right? I think there's some themes, there's some categories, but I think one of the challenges, like I'm in a relationship with someone that is half Chinese, half Japanese, who is 4th, 5th generation Asian American, and I'm Korean American, 2nd generation. And like there are just so many things that are just like all across the board, you know? So what's like the one maybe takeaway, one approach, especially in, I feel like this hybrid society, specifically, I think in the US that we're seeing, like how would you, you know, apply this 3D gospel to something that's maybe not as clear as just like maybe someone that's in a specific, you know, Asian American context where like they're just Korean American or Chinese American? Like any thoughts there?
or just another way of phrasing the question is like when it's cross-cultural, right? Even within the small idiosyncrasies of 2nd gen versus 4th and 5th gen, how does that sort of play into marriages or relationships?
I think the first step is self-awareness. So one of the things that we did in the class was talk about your family migration history. Like interview somebody in your family, whether it's a parent, a grandparent, someone, just ask like, hey, can you tell me about like the story about how we ended up in America? And so, and students came back and they said, wow, I didn't realize that about my family history. And then asking them to think about and reflect, how do you think that's affected you? How do you think that your upbringing with all these stories, or maybe you're the immigrant, right? That you experienced, how do you think that impacted you, your worldview, how you see things, your leadership, all those things? And so the more you understand yourself, the more you're able to minister to others, the more you understand your tendencies, your culture, your worldview, all those things, the more you can say, okay, I'm seeing and observing something in somebody else that's either similar or different than me. You can minister to them, I believe, more effectively because of your awareness. So again, the first step is self-awareness, and then the second step is knowing your people well. And that's and I think a lot of times in seminary, we were taught to know our people well, but I don't think we were taught well to know ourselves well. And so what do I bring to the table? How do I see things? What's my leadership style? How is that been shaped by my experiences or my family history?
Um, can I model for you a little bit about like how I would apply the 3D gospel to like my life? Yeah, I'm not gonna ask. I'm just gonna do it. So I mean, your situation is unique, right? Your wife is half Japanese, half Chinese. You're Korean American. My wife is 100%, pure Chinese, and so am I, And so theoretically, it should be easy to cross these cultural boundaries, but they're not, right? Because my family is from northern China. My parents went to Beijing University. My wife's parents originate partially from Indonesia, Hong Kong, Guangdong area, and are not well educated. And so they have different perceptions of what Chinese culture even means, right? And so when me and my wife were brainstorming about how we could best minister to her mom, um, we struggled because my parents we first thought about my parents being like a good vessel to bring the gospel. But when my mom met her mom, like they didn't understand each other very well. Like my mom took her to a opera, and my mom was like, "Yo, Chinese people love like Mozart and Beethoven, and Chinese people do love classical music if they're well educated and have exposure to the West." But Mindy's mom didn't. Mindy's mom, that's my wife's name. She has a lot of more fear power oriented cultural dynamics in her family, right? Like she believes in fortune telling, she believes in this idea in Chinese called Ming. Ming is like fate, you know. My parents talked more about faith. I mean, she talks about faith too, but faith also, but she talks about fate a lot more than she talks about faith, which is very much like a fear power oriented. And so we thought about maybe we should try to introduce her to a more like charismatic or Pentecostal background church, because they do a lot better job ministering to people from fear power context. This is like one way to potentially apply it, because every strain of Christianity interacts with these cultures differently. And so that's kind of like a way that we're trying to work out how we could apply this 3D gospel.
I think one of the things that when we start learning about categories and we start learning about different buckets that people fit in, we start realizing, oh, we don't fit perfectly.
Yeah.
And so part of learning the categories is starting a journey and saying, okay, part of me fits here, but part of me fits there. And then this other person, part of they fit this way and that way. That makes us better ministers and better carriers of the gospel as we know ourselves. So one of the things I wanted to say at the class that we were part of together was, this is just the beginning. This is a journey that you're on. So I want to be part of that journey for you as you start thinking in this way, because it's not going to fit so perfectly. That we're overgeneralizing now, but then as you look at nuances, you start thinking, oh, this person has some of this and some of that, and I can't draw neat lines. Yeah. But that's the body of Christ, isn't it? So we know how we can minister that, and we have a framework and a strategy.
Thank you. I think that was like super helpful, and it like, I know I didn't ask my question well, but I think it's because the thought in my head is like, oh my goodness, we are heading towards like a new generation where the lines aren't as clear. Like there's so many more, little variations that are gonna be popping up. And so I loved your takeaway of just like, ask about like your roots, ask about your family, how you grew up. And it'll be interesting in this new generation of what that looks like, right?
Yeah, I think because Asian Americanness and Asian American culture is like constantly evolving. It's so young and new. The most of the immigrants who came from Asia came in like what, the 80s and the 90s. So less than 50 years old, right? And so there is a lot of change, but I think something hopeful from Ecclesiastes is there is nothing new under the sun. You know, everything that a human could value has been valued by somebody somewhere. And so the cultures that are emerging, they all take values from the cultures that they were birthed from. And so we have the tools in the Word of God to adequately minister to whoever comes next.
Yeah, thinking about applying the 3D gospel to life, I think is best used as a springboard, like a starting place to get thinking about the gospel in different ways, in new perspectives, right? Like going back to my own example of like before I was swimming in a lake, now I'm swimming in the ocean, right? So like it'll take some practice and like some guidance from the Holy Spirit, but next time you're doing your quiet time or doing a Bible study, like be really intentional about looking for those other perspectives in there, and just try and see how God is speaking to a perspective and a culture other than your own. And then as you do that, and as you get more well versed in like shifting between different perspectives, you'll be able to apply it better to the people that you're seeing in front of you. Going back to what Professor Daniel said about knowing your audience, right? And then also knowing yourself is also really important too. But yeah, just this idea of like a toolbox. It's like a toolbox. New tools for you to work with as you think about the gospel and learn to apply it to your life. And I also think this is a slightly different note, but one of the people when I was doing my training, the person who was talking to me about cross cultural ministry and was using 3D gospel as an example, she asked this question of like, there's actually a pretty sizable shame honor group that no one ever talks about or thinks about. She took some guesses from people and she said, well, it's American teenagers. Anyone who's grown up on social media has a huge honor shame tinge to their worldview because it's all about how people perceive you on the internet. And so I think where it could apply to this conversation is like things that the Asian American community can like learn and grow from, can really be helped to just apply to the future generation of America as a whole. People who are constantly growing up with others looking at them and constantly being afraid of how they're perceived within their community and those around them.
I just want to take a moment and just say like this conversation just makes me just be in awe of just how incredible and powerful the gospel is, because right, even just within these three categories we're thinking about, wow, like some people think within like guilt versus innocence, some people have stronger affinity towards honor and shame, and some people think along the line of power and fear. But yet it's incredible that the gospel does speak to any of these categories. And the thing is, the gospel transcends culture at the end of the day, like truly through history and time, that the gospel has been spreading throughout the entire world. And it truly is the global religion that speaks into any culture, that penetrates through even the most unique and just most isolated cultures out there. And yeah, like kind of what Danny and Austin were talking about too. Like who knows what what our culture will be like in the next generation, in the next 10, 20 years. But one thing we do know is that the gospel will speak to that culture. The gospel will penetrate their hearts and they will come to know God. So I think, yeah, this conversation really just made me appreciate just the power of the gospel. Like it is something we're not ashamed of, but it is the power of God for salvation. And wow, that's just amazing.
Yeah. And like just thinking about that, I firmly believe that the gospel redeems culture. It doesn't transcend it in a way that's like totally unique or disassociated from it. Like all of the cultures are going to be represented in the kingdom. Revelation 7, 9, and 10, right? People from every nation, tribe, and language are there. And so like I firmly believe that every culture reflects God. Every culture also is twisted by sin, but like The gospel is saving the cultures of the world. It's not replacing them.
Yeah, and I think, ultimately, in order for us as Christians to continue to be able to be best equipped to minister to this next generation, I think there's such great power in listening to the stories of those that we are trying to minister to. I think it really helps give us a picture of which tools we should use in our gospel tool belt to best um, explain this incredible good news that Jesus has for us. Like I remember um, sitting. So my mother-in-law, like she cuts my hair. She owns a hair salon, and so I would sit I was stuck with her for like 30 minutes, and we're like chatting in Chinese, and she would make comments about my like cowlick. So I have like multiple cowlicks, and she was like, "Oh, you're so lucky. Like this means you're lucky." And I always just assumed that she was just a regular. I mean, it's just superstitious Chinese mom, whatever. But the more that I asked about her life because I was stuck there for 30 minutes every, 2 months, I started to see the way that she saw the world. And it really helped me to think about like what gospel tools could I use. And I'm still yet to fully know and understand that. And I hope to listen to her more and hear her story and understand how she sees the world and how that could be redeemed by the gospel.
I think you're getting to the core of something that all of us are sort of going through, which is this this process of the way I've always talked about it. I think it's like a fish. If you ask it what water is, it's kind of like, what's water? Because it's just been swimming in it its whole life. For us to sort of not just understand the water we've been swimming through, but also understand the water that other people have been swimming through, it really takes intentional listening and questions and a heart that is deeply interested in the individuals and in the collectives around us. And this is why I think there's such a strong like movement towards therapy. There's such a strong movement towards these sort of reflective intonations across all of America right now, especially within the Christian world, where people are trying to figure out these things about themselves. But I think that that is leading and setting a trajectory towards, regardless of whether you are American, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Hispanic, Latino, you can come in and you can sit at a table and you can hear and listen, and you can slowly and surely, with some of the frameworks that you've been taught that no one will ever fit perfectly into, begin to understand that person's context, their water, if you will, in your own language, in the way that you can sort of relate to. And I really think that that is the greatest skill, in my mind at least, that Jesus had when he met people throughout his ministry, that he, with one look, knew everything. He understood all of that context, and he understood all of the different unique challenges that those people had faced, and he empathized with all of it, and he was a minister to all of it. All right. I really want to not cut this short, but I'll have one last question. We talked a little bit about reading about shame and honor. Does anyone have recommendations in terms of books of the Bible that they would say are good for developing an understanding of honor, shame? And maybe we'll close this time out after that.
I think the story of Ruth is a really powerful example of someone being honored who doesn't deserve it. In a sense, Ruth she's a Moabite, and if you know the story of how the Moabites originate, it's a deeply shameful story, right? And Ruth's people should be ashamed of their heritage in a sense, right? But God, through Boaz, redeems her and restores her honor and includes her in Jesus's lineage, the ultimate honor in a sense. And so I think the story of Ruth is full of examples of honor and shame at work. And so I highly recommend Ruth.
I'm gonna go with Luke. Luke has a lot uh, of these accounts that really highlight the group, and so we start seeing things like how Jesus is interacting with both the Jewish religious leaders, but also people in that society that were marginalized. So we start seeing Jesus interacting with people who needed healing, whether it was people who had diseases or people who were demon possessed, and these people were marginalized. Sometimes they're beggars because they either couldn't hold a job, or they wouldn't be able to get a job, and so these are on the margins of society, and yet Jesus brings them in, and he actually says that the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And the lost, we think of that as like, oh, a lot of times we think of that as, oh, they're sinners and they need to be in right relationship with God. But every time he talks about the lost, it's about people who were marginalized. And so one of the climaxes in Luke is Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is totally marginalized, and the way he's treated by the crowd kind of tells us how his reality is, like how everyday life is. And so when Jesus says, "I accept you," that's when his life changes. He's so touched by that he says, "Hey, I'm just gonna I'm start." He starts to repent and saying, "Okay, he's so touched by Jesus wanting to spend time with him." And so we start seeing the people being restored that were alienated. So we have all these passages you need to look like the Good Samaritan, where it talks about the people groups, Samaritans and Jews, and so there's esteemed people, the priest and the Levite, and then there's the hated Samaritan, and the Samaritan ends up being the hero. And so I think, and so we can see a lot of those dynamics of the inside outside language.
Speaking of Samaritans, I thought of the woman at the well as an example. I've heard it taught that she's there alone, like she's not gathering water at the time that anyone else would. So she's, marginalized, not part of the group in the community. And then Jesus, a Jewish man, starts talking to her, right? But then he reveals that he is the Messiah to her. And I don't know exactly the chronology of it, but like she's probably one of the first people to hear that Jesus is the Messiah. And she goes back into town and tells everyone, and everyone listens, and they all come and see Jesus with her. So she's like reinstated in a sense back into the community because of how Jesus has, told her of her life. It's easy to focus on, at least in American culture, it's easy to focus on the guilt part of that story with like her being around with a bunch of guys. But there's a lot of honor shame to that as well. And I think almost sort of a cop-out answer to what you're saying is that I think honor shame is everywhere in the Bible. You just need to look for it. Any of the passages you normally like and love, you can just try and reread it, and I'm sure you'll find honor shame in there.
The story that comes to my mind is actually the story of Moses. And just growing up when I was young, the story of Moses, that's a story of a man who turned the Nile into blood. He split the Red Sea. He did some crazy miracles. And I would say he did some of the most, he did the things that seem impossible, right? Even making water come out of a rock, even making manna come down on his people. But if you look at the life of Moses, how it all started, it's a man who was deeply shamed. He ran away from Egypt and he lived in Midian by himself, detached from his people for 40 years. And it's actually interesting because our church is going through the life of Moses right now in our sermon series. And our recent discussion, we talked about just trying to imagine the state of Moses, knowing that his own people is being oppressed, is being exploited as slaves to another nation, and he ran away from his problem. He abandoned his people, and he was all by himself. And again, 40 years passed, but yet it was God who came to him. It was God who came to him in a burning bush and said that God would rescue his people using Moses specifically. And he restored honor to Moses. Even when Moses first came back, his people did not accept him. Yet God used Moses and restored his status as the leader of the nation. And he's the one who led the nation to the promised land. And that's just such a beautiful story of how God restored one man's honor, who was just filled with shame. And again, it's the beauty is that it's not that Moses was so desperately seeking God in Midian. It was that God came to him in a burning bush and truly just restored Moses' life. Yeah.
I think for me, the story that comes to mind is the simple woman that visits Jesus when he is visiting a Pharisee. She's the one who literally cries tears to wash his feet and to break open alabaster jar of perfume to anoint him. And through that, it's just truly she experienced the restoration of her honor, of being someone in her community as someone who was to be shamed. And Jesus, in that moment, even speaking to the Pharisees, saying, "Hey, I stepped into your house, and what did you do for me?" And yet this woman came in and did all this for me and restored her honor in that moment. I think that is just like one of the most powerful depictions of honor in the Bible for me.
That was actually what I was going to say too. Because it's well, plus one to it, but also it was the most important passage I think in my spiritual walk during college, because I was stuck on it for maybe like half a year, just staring at that one passage, because Jesus said, "He who is forgiven much will love much. He who is forgiven little will love little." And I could not understand that. I was like, wait, I thought Jesus forgave everyone equally. And I was thinking about it, and the conclusion that I got to after those 6 months was that Jesus forgave both the Pharisee and the woman for their sins. But it was a question of whether or not they, A, recognized their need for forgiveness, and B, allowed Jesus to forgive them for those problems. And I actually think, sort of in closing here, that's an encouragement I would have for all of us in regards to shame and to fear and to guilt. There are things in our lives that maybe we just haven't let God use the gospel on, even though we already are in power, in honor, in just freedom. And that is sort of just a lie that we've been living in. And I think whether it's for one reason or another, we've just sort of accepted those things. But God has already set us free. God has already given us honor. God has already wiped the slate clean. And it's really the question that Jesus was really getting at when he talked to Simon the Pharisee, I think, is a challenge for all of us with regards to all of this. Do we want God to come in and actually forgive us? Do we actually want to see our need for forgiveness in these aspects of our lives? That was great. Thank you all for sharing. What a rich conversation. I know my brain is like struggling to hold on from all the crazy just richness of that conversation. I'm really appreciative of all of you. And yeah, we'll be back again for another episode, but hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully you're able to read some of those passages in your time. And yeah, we'll be back with another episode. So